The next part that we're going to add to our project is producer bases. Let's just do that right now. We're going to add the producer base for the fox to stand on, and we're going to add a producer base that's a bucket for food to be put into. Okay, so I'm going to quickly interrupt my own recording here to talk about the templates that we're about to implement. I didn't show making them in this recording because I want to do some standalone tutorials on making the templates. But just so you know what we're putting into our table, we have the icons. They'll be resed into your icon generator, like spawned into your icon generator, and a picture will be taken of them, and that will show up in your inventory. And that's these two. That's the two templates labeled icon. Then we have two labeled drops. These are normally slightly scaled down versions of whatever the object is. That will drop on the ground if the player either drops it out of their inventory or if you collect it from something like crafting or a producer. Then we have the static template, which would be used in cases where you need collision on the object. Now, that could be, in the case of this bucket or this hill, I'm just going to use them as their own collision because they're just one item straight out of core content. I might as well just use core's collision for them. But it could also be invisible collision. So I've given an example of that here. Say I wanted this giant bowl of udon and I wanted you to be able to collide with it. The collision model for it would look like this, and then I would just go like this, and I would use this toggle here to force the visibility off. But you would still, your player would still walk into that, right? So that would be an example of invisible collision that could be put in a static template. And then the last category of thing we have here is a client template. Now, in my case, one of my client templates is empty because the stuff that I'm going to put in it I haven't made yet. In the other case, I have just this fork and knife, which I'm going to turn on and off with one of our reactive component scripts. But this template could also be used just for fancy geo that the player doesn't need to collide with, but the player needs to look at. So for example, if there was like pebbles on this hill, the player doesn't need to walk into the pebbles. So we would put the pebbles into the client template for that object. Client is for geo that has no collision, so decorative geometry, and also for reactive components. Those are a type of little script that you can drop in things to make stuff happen in the farming framework, and I will teach you how to use those later. Static, again, for either visible geometry with collision or invisible collision. Drops drop on the ground, and icons show up in the inventory. So when we get to hooking all this data up and you see me dragging in asset references, this is what I'm dragging in. These things have been made into templates, and this is what the template names look like here. And then we're going to hook them up when the time comes. To do that, we first need to add an item for them because we have to be able to hold them in our inventory. Anything that can be held by the player in their inventory or hotbar needs to have an entry into the items table. And then we'll need an entry into the placeables table as well. And while we're at it, we'll probably make the entries for them into the drops table so that later on when we're ready for it, the player could get them as a drop. So let's start with that. Generally, when I'm setting up tables, I go items first, then I add the drops because I need the item ID to make the drop. And then I normally do whatever the next sets are. So in our case, we're going to be making a producer base, which I keep opening the producer table for, but a producer base is actually a type of placeable. That's the other table we'll need. So those are the three tables we're going to be using in this video while we set up the bases. So first, let's add the items. Generally speaking, when you're first starting out, if you don't know what to do, I recommend starting with a copy of something that works basically the way you want it to work already so that the right boxes and stuff are checked. And that should probably work fine in our case. It's fine. Let's add this. Let's copy the decorative table because it's another placeable item. I think I wanted to call it a grassy spot. That's the spot where you'll be allowed to put out foxes. It's the base for foxes. So I'll give it the same name as its ID. And then we're going to make our bucket. Context actions are what can happen when you right click on something. It's not an inventory. An inventory would be a chest, so you can ignore that. I don't really care about the stack limit on these, so we're not going to change that. But we are going to need to change the art, so let's find... So we need the drop art that I made previously, and we need the icon. Oops, I just put those in the wrong ones. And we need the food bucket. So we just added the art for the drop template and the art for the icon asset. Icon camera ID is because you can have multiple icon generators in your scene, and then you could like give them different backgrounds. This icon we added is a 3D icon, so 3D icon should be checked. These are equipable. I don't know if you noticed, but this grassy spot one I copied from the item above, but this food bucket one I just added a new line. So you could kind of see both workflows. Hand tool is anything that's not needing special animation functionality and stuff. You generally just use the hand tool as the equipment template. If you scroll up to the top, you'll see that the pickaxes and the sickles and stuff, they actually have their own equipment template that's custom made just for them. You don't need that for stuff with functionality like this. So you're fine to just use this hand tool look. Equipment visual template is needed if you want to be able to hold that thing in your hand. I use this if it's like a seed packet, I hold it. But if it's something that I place on the ground that's going to have a hologram in front of me, I haven't been putting anything there. So in this case, I'm just going to leave that empty. This is where we can write a longer description for the thing. So this is where you can get fancy and do some storytelling if you want. Then we have the ability to add, you can have a different, slightly larger icon if you wanted as your like detailed image of the fox, or maybe you want a close-up of its head or something. We're not worried about that right now. This thing here lets you have a different look to your detail screen if you want, and you would reference it here. But this is good enough for what we're doing. We just needed to make those items. Now we need to make them into drops so that the player can get them. Anything the player can get in the world from crafting or buying in a store needs a drop. Eventually, we're actually going to have you buy these at the pet store. So let's just insert a couple rows. The most important thing here is this item ID. This item ID needs to match the item ID you just made for those items. So let's put that in first. That one's going to be a grassy spot. This one's going to be a food bucket. Now we need a name here. I guess I'll just call it a drop. This field here is the ID. This isn't visible to the player. This is for you. This notes column, again, is just an optional column where you can put details on something. So I normally write how the player can acquire that drop. So just to remind myself later where this is being used. We only ever need something in one of these three columns, right? Just like with when we talked about with the hearts currency. So this one is an item. We already put the item ID in, so we leave currency ID and upgrade ID blank. When you buy it, you're only going to get one. So these will go 1 to 1. And it'll be 100% of the time. People would be pretty mad if they only got them a percentage of the time. And that's all we have to do in that table. It now exists as a drop, so we can access this information later when we need it. The next thing we need to do is to actually make it an object that can be placed. Right now it is not. It's an item. You could hold it in your hand, but you couldn't put it in the world. So that's not really what we want. So the ID here, you're gonna want that to match what it's called over here in this table. So you can just copy that same ID, and now that can be the placeable ID as well. This is the name that the player sees. So this one's an ID. Remember, it only really matters to you. This one is the name that the player is gonna see. In our case, it's fine for it to be the same. I mean, there's no real reason to have it as something different. These tags are used to limit how many of these things can be put out. Unique storage ID is very important. Make sure that this number does not overlap with any other numbers in the list. That's why we added to the bottom, and that way we can just count up. It has to be unique. If it is not, like if I had two things that were number 15, they would actually, the sort of stored data wouldn't know which thing I was said existed there, so you'd get unpredictable results. It's hard to say which one would show up or how it would act. So now let's find the art that we made for these. Let's go find the grassy spot art. So I have both a client and a static for this that I made. Let's find the other one. Client in the client asset reference, static in the static. Oops, I put that in the wrong one. Oh, bad me. If you select this and you hit delete, you can clear it. Try that again. I forgot there was a server column in this table. Again, I'm not really using it for anything. It can be empty, that's fine. For now, we're just gonna copy these valid replicator identifiers. You don't need to worry about that for this, that's fine. The place tool is if you need a special tool to be able to put out this placeable. In this case though, we don't need any special tool. We're just going to use our hand. Use the hammer to remove is fine. The hammer is sort of a default removal tool in this framework and we're okay with that. I don't have any special effects that I've made just for this one. So I'm just going to use the same place on dirt and the same pick up off dirt ones that I'm using everywhere else here. But you can make custom effects and put them in here. This checkbox means that when you place the item, it removes one from your inventory. But if you wanted to make, say, a toolbar with building choices on it in your hotbar, right? And you don't actually run out of them, like you can put down as many of the buildings as you want, then you wouldn't check this. But we want these to be removed from our inventory when we place them, so we'll put there. Placement preview is a hologram that's going to show up when you put this object down. So we can just the static art. We want for the preview, we want the thing that's going to look like our object. Bucket, yeah, it's also in static. So those will make the holograms. The material on them will be changed to the hologram material, and they'll show us where we're placing our thing. Placement overlap check trigger is just, it's like a little trigger that checks if there's an object already placed there. You can make custom ones if you need to. For this, it's probably fine to use the basic one, so I'm going to just do that. Placement area types. Now here's where things get a little bit interesting. If you'll recall, we made a placement area just for these placeables, and we called it pet yard. This is the connection to that information. This is where you need to put that. So now the grassy spot and the food bucket can only be put down in a thing that's been set to be a pet yard. I'm fine with you rotating it. The grid size here doesn't actually matter because we don't have snap to grid on. Cost is how you could make it cost money or something to place something down. Dirt costs compost, so that's an example of how you would use that. Drop in world on remove is fine. In a case of a decorative item like this that the player is putting down and picking up, you're going to want the drop behavior set to solo, because otherwise if I picked up, like I used the hammer on my table to make it so that it's not attached to the ground anymore. If I had this set to community, then anyone standing nearby would get a copy of the table or whatever. So that's, you know, in the case of harvesting a bush, everybody getting the wood is great. So having a community behavior on that is awesome. But on something like this where you're lifting up a piece of furniture that the player has made or bought, you want this set to solo. We are going to need some buff stuff, but not yet. And here's the thing that makes it a producer base. So producer base notes, I'm just going to copy this. This is what's important. Both of these are producer bases. Those two checkboxes is what lets you like plant something in it essentially. And the producer base type, this is what's going to dictate what can be put here. So let's call this an animal spot, because then I could make a different animal spot that looked a different way, but they'd still be allowed to put a fox on it later. So that's why this is sort of a tag and not a specific thing. And for the food, let's make it animal feeder. Keep track of these kinds of things. You can refer back to the table to see them, but you're probably going to forget where you put them. So when you have a value or a ID that you know you're going to need in other spots, I really think it's wise to like just jot it down until you're done setting up the system or keep it in a spreadsheet. I just have a piece of paper in front of me right now that says pet yard, animal spot, and animal feeder to remind me what I need to put in these boxes. We don't need an initial producer ID for this. We're not worried about expiry. Oops, I missed kind of an important column here. Make sure that the build rate is set to at least 1 on any producer. It doesn't matter on a barrel or something like that, but if you're making a producer, you need a build rate. If it's set to 1, that means it'll build at the normal speed. If you set it to 0.5, then the thing built there will build at a slow speed. If you set it to 2, then the thing built there will build quickly. So you could, for example, make fertile soil and less fertile soil and put different build rates on it. But for our example here, make sure you've set those 2 values to 1. We're not worried about any of this except for maybe allow producer removal. This will let the player pick the fox back up off the base. So I think that makes sense for the grassy spot, but you know, I'll let you remove food too, but you're not going to get anything back if you do. I think that's what we'll do there. Again, these notes are not read by the code, they're just for the user. The next part is for crafting tables, and the next part is for inventories like chests. So we don't need any of those segments. This should be complete now. So what we can do is just see if we made a mistake. So let's do that. Let's hit play and let's see if we messed up. Oh, I forgot one very important step. Not to the functionality of anything, but right now I don't have a way to actually get those things that we just made. I forget this all the time. So we want to add them to our starting items. And in fact, I think we want to change our starting items so that we're using the cheat list, if I haven't already. So let's go just check what our starting items are set to. Yeah, it's already set to the test set. So this isn't the balance that you start with the game. There's a separate table for that, and you can just drag it into this slot if you want to change it. So if you click on starting items, if you drag in this one into that slot on here, so you would just drag this over there if you wanted it there, it's only got a few things on it because that's what a player should actually start with. But when I'm working on the game, I like to have a lot more items than that. So I have this big test thing. So we're just going to add the 2 new things that we just added to this table. Just use their item ID, same as you did before, just like that. You can just go in their main inventory. This is which square of the inventory would be. Each little square is called a slot. This is how many they get. I mean, 99 is probably excessive for these, so we'll just do that. And then we'll hit File, Save All, and we should be good. Now we're going to hit play again. When we do this, when we play test something like this, where we've changed starting items or something that's given to the player initially, remember to hit F1. That's why it's up in the corner there in that giant black box, so you don't forget, because you can't see a data change if you haven't hit F1. So when I hit F1, if you notice my currency set back to 50,000, my hearts went to 0. If I open my inventory now, here's my 2 new items. I haven't adjusted the icons. We'll do that at the end. So there's the food, there's the bucket. There, so that's good. Let's just put those on our hotbar actually. Notice it's not letting me place it here. That's to be expected because we told it that it needed to be in the pet area to be placed. So if I try to place stuff anywhere here right now, it's not working. That is also expected because we haven't bought this land. So it says 5,000 to unlock. So let's buy that. Now, there we go, it's green. So that means it's working. It means the placement area we initially put on the pen is working, and it means the actual placeable animal spot things are working. So let's test our other item. It should be the same. Yeah, it doesn't let me put it out here because those are not valid spots. It only wants to be placed in an animal pen. So there we go, we got our food. So that's it for this video, I think. We've done what we set out to do here, and we'll cover the next thing in the next video.